All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank everyone who's joining. Today, this is Christopher Urbane. I'm the webinar coordinator for the ASQ Inspection Division. Today, we have with us a special guest. We have changed the time from our evening events, so this is a pleasant surprise. Today with us is Mike Ford. Mike is actually a personal friend of mine. I've known him for many years through an APIX conference, which he spoke at long ago. It was interesting because before I got to know Mike, people asked me if I knew him, and I was like, no, and they were like, what? How can you not know Mike Ford? And I didn't know Mike was one of those guys that was one of the speakers along with the traveling circus of circuit speakers and instructors that do conferences. So Mike very recently completed his third engineering degree in 2016, which was an MS in Industrial and Systems Engineering. As you can see, he has over 9 professional certifications through ASQ and APIX, which is American Production Inventory Control Society. Mike has done almost 400 presentations all across US, Canada, Japan, South Africa, Australia, and Nigeria. Mr. Ford has over 5,800 hours of classroom instruction as a professional instructor and corporate trainer, but he is most proud of handling over 1 million pieces of inventory as a warehouse, loading and unloading trucks, and the highlight of his career has to be hand stacking over 9 tons of beef in less than 2 hours. With that being said, I would like to present Mike Ford. Mike, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Chris, and I thank the ASQ's Inspection Division for allowing me this opportunity to share what I expect to be a very informative, educational, and hopefully some interesting anecdotes along the way. I would like to note you have access to a chat feature, so if you come up with questions along the way, please feel free to type them in. We will say that we will handle Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you think of a question, feel free to type those in, and Chris will ask me those towards the end of the presentation. I'd like to share why inspection is important to me so you can gain a personal feel for who I am, know about who Ford is besides the guy with the wraparound business card. My experience has primarily been in supply chain roles, inventory planning or purchasing, and it was very interesting. The last regular job I had over 20 years ago, before I had this irregular job as a consultant and corporate trainer, I was in purchasing, and most other people in purchasing, not to criticize them, they rose from the ranks of inventory control or the stock room, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I was the only one who had an engineering degree and really understood what the products were. A lot of the buyers were like, well, parts is parts. You know, they just knew the part was part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They didn't know what injection molding or extrusion or stuff was. So we sort of said quality, well, that's not our problem in purchasing. That's inspection or engineering or the quality department. And I've always believed that everybody in your organization, you got 10,000 employees, well, that's 10,000 employees responsible for quality. It's not just the people in inspection. I also have to confess my frustration when something would get rejected from inspection. I'd have to look at it, we get an engineer, we get somebody involved. Oh, the customer really needs this. Well, just sign a variance and pass it. And I'm like, what is the point in inspecting stuff if every other item that's rejected, we just sign a variance and say, okay, let it go through. So the frustrations that I had with inspection operations as a regular employee 20 years ago were somewhat the genesis for this topic. The agenda that we're going to have for this session, I also wanted to note my history as a lean practitioner and big lean advocate. We teach within lean that inspection is non-value added. So what is value? Well, value is anything the customer is willing to pay for. And over my 20 years of training, I quite often have students who will challenge me on this and say, no, inspection adds value. I go, really? Can you charge more for a product because you inspected it? What did you do to add value? So I would say anything that adds value means you can charge more for your product. And if you believe inspection adds value, well, I got a hell of a way for you to make a lot of profit. Inspect it again and again and again and again. Does that keep adding more value? Inspection does nothing to add value. It might tell you whether a part's good or bad, but a bad part is bad before and after inspection. A good part is good either before or after inspection. Inspection did nothing to add value. So I quote Harold S. Dodge, you cannot inspect quality into a product. The agenda we'll start out with the 4 costs of quality. I think that's very important for us to start out with that so we can understand how inspection or auditing or sampling fits into that. I'll describe a scenario where we do 100% inspection, the scenario that suggests we do no inspection, and the scenario that suggests we're doing statistical sampling. And then we'll wrap it up by talking about process auditing, which will lead to the concept of best practices. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. The 4 costs of quality. Well, first, there are the costs of poor quality. And there's 2 subcategories within that. There are external failures, which implies a bad product went out the door. It went downstream. A lot of times we think this means the end user or consumer, but we could say, you know, a supply chain has lots of manufacturers who build sub-assemblies or final assemblies along the way. You know, what we produce looks like a finished good. To the downstream manufacturer, they say, no, that's a purchased component. So really anything that goes downstream. It could be a distribution center. It could be a retail store. And again, we usually think of this in terms of the consumer. But it's really anything that has gone out the door and we didn't catch it. The internal failure implies, well, there's some defective product and we caught it before it went out the door. Besides the costs of poor quality, there are the costs of good quality. There are also 2 subtopics here as well. The first is appraisal. And I will suggest that appraisal could mean, well, we're either checking a product or we're checking a process. There are also the costs of prevention, and that's where we like to pump our money in. I have actually listed these in order from the worst place to spend money to the best place to spend money. In other words, external failures is the worst thing. I don't like internal failures, but it's better than something going out the door. Now, rather than an internal failure, I would rather do the inspection and catch it. Again, we know it doesn't add value, but it's still better than something being passed downstream from one operation to the next. But the best place to pump your resources, time, energy, effort, cash, is in prevention. This slide is going to highlight how, as a defective part gets passed downstream, the costs and risks become significantly higher. As an example, let us say my supplier sent a defective product to me. Now, I would have rather it gets caught at the supplier. If not, I'd like to catch it at my door or at the Gateway Work Center at Operation 10. But every time that product keeps going farther and farther downstream, from Operation 10 to Operation 20 to Operation 30, we're adding more materials, more labor, more overhead. It's more and more cost, till ultimately, if it gets into a distribution network or a retail store or the end user, a consumer, that is the highest cost, and that's the worst scenario. So catching things much earlier or preventing them is what we aspire to have. The external failure costs include warranty claims, returns replacing the product recalls. We're familiar with these as consumers in food and beverage or pharmaceuticals, or certainly the automotive industry is a very common example. The cost of litigation, we're going to get sued, all right? Sued for damages, which can go into the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars when we're talking about the loss of life. And I'll pose a question, just food for thought. We won't answer it here, but I do a critical thinking workshop in which I ask the audience, what is the value of a human life? Just think about that here in terms of how I suggest external failure is the last place you want to be spending money, how that ties into litigation. There's also going to be the lost sales, because people are going to say, you know what, I'm not buying your product anymore. And they just say there's that damage to the reputation. And I think a lot of companies fail to realize that is the most significant cost. And too many companies think of external failures. They go, okay, it's the warranty. I got to replace it, maybe send a field service representative. No, it's the damage to your reputation. Because somebody's going to say, gee, I keep seeing these recalls for car company ABC. Well, ain't nobody going to step on the lot. Nobody's going to want to buy your car when you've got that reputation for lots of recalls. That's the most significant one, and we tend to significantly undervalue that. The next category is going to be the internal failure. So we say there could be both scrap and rework. Now, what is the distinction here between scrap and rework? Rework is something that we can rework, or we can perform some activity, task, send it back through the work centers. We can bring it into compliance. Scrap is something that is out of compliance, and there's really no way to fix it. I'll give you a simple example of one of my fun in-person workshops called Ice Cream Sundae Production, and where I have the audience make ice cream sundaes. Well, an example of rework could be somebody made a chocolate sundae and somebody wanted peanuts on it, but they were left off. Well, you can rework it. You can send that back and say, add the peanuts. Scrap would be, well, you added the peanuts and somebody didn't want them. Well, what is the inspector going to lick them off or eat them or something? Well, you've still got the peanuts residue or whatever in there if somebody has allergies. So that's not going to work. So there's a distinction. We have these variable costs, as I mentioned before. As something goes through a routing through all of these work centers, you're adding more labor, material, and also the factory overhead. There can be delays to the schedule because of the fact that, well, now this job is held up because we either had to scrap something or it's going to take time to rework it. And maybe we got to work overtime or come in on the weekends. Maybe we need to expedite some more material. Or now we're going to have to FedEx it overnight to the customer to make sure they get it on time. Ultimately, if we can't fix the delays, the customer will be impacted. Now, whether they know it was because of scrap or rework is irrelevant. They just know they expect to get the perfect order. What is the perfect order to the customer? It is the right quality, the right quantity of the right item, delivered at the right time to the right place, the right person, for the right price, with the right documentation, and the right level of customer service. Everything has to be perfect. You can't say, well, it was perfect, except it was 2 days late. Well, they ordered 1,000. Well, we gave them $9.99. That doesn't work. We live in a world of very demanding expectations and instant gratification. Customers want it all, and they want it fast. If your companies believe, well, too bad, they ain't going to get it, I guarantee you your competitors will take care of that for you. The opportunity cost is very important here, my friends. As with the external failure, I suggested a lot of companies undervalue that because they say, oh, it's just the cost of the return and sending a replacement product. No, it was the damage to the reputation. In this case, with the internal failure, I think so many manufacturers just say, well, we scrap something out. Well, it's just the material cost. Well, as I said before, in the second bullet, it's not just the material, it's the labor and the overhead that went into that. But I'm going to go beyond that. Because in addition to recognizing that the cost to build a bad part is just as expensive as the cost to building a good part, the opportunity cost means instead of spending that labor and material and overhead for a scrap part, you could have built a good one that you could have sold to the marketplace. Again, I think a lot of manufacturers are valuing scrap at maybe the cost of goods sold. So let's say a particular widget. It's $1 labor, $1 material, $1 overhead. Oh, $3 COGS. You scrap it out, it costs us $3. Well, what if you actually sell that widget for $5? I'm telling you the cost of scrap is $5 because instead of building the good part, you could have, or a bad part, you could have bought a good one and sold it. I say profit should be included in that. And when companies start recognizing this opportunity cost, it highlights how much scrap or rework costs and gets us to improve our quality so we make the good parts, sell them, and make the profit. I'd be very interested in knowing if we're agreed with that point of view. With the external failure, I suggested the most devastating aspect is the damage to our brand name reputation. The same thing happens with internal failure. It's a negative perception, but now it's internal. It's among our workforce. Any place where there's high scrap rates and we're not aspiring to 100% yields, we don't have this zero defect mentality, people start to shrug their shoulders. They're like, yeah, we scrap parts. We did it yesterday. We did it last week. We did it last year. Yeah, bad parts are just part of the environment. And that's the most devastating aspect of the internal failure. We accept it. We're willing to tolerate defects. I'm not trying to get political here. I just want to make what I hope is a fair analogy. Tolerance for defects leads to defects, just like tolerance for crime leads to crime. That is from a Reader's Digest article I read back in 1980 that talked about why is America, with the highest GDP in the world, have so much crime. The Reader's Digest article said, any society's level of crime is proportional to their tolerance. Same things with defects. If you tolerate it, you accept it, you're going to have scrap. Okay, so external and internal failure were both part of the cost of poor quality. Now we're going to talk about the cost of good quality, the appraisal, which I suggested there were two types of appraisals. The first is product inspection. I am checking to see whether it's raw material coming from our suppliers, work in process on the floor, or at the end of the line, some final testing on the finished goods. It could be pre-shipment. In other words, finished goods were stored in a distribution center or warehouse. Then we check them again before we ship them out to a customer. Again, any testing along the way, whether it's on the line or if it goes off the line towards some testing area. As opposed to checking the product, we could check the process. A little bit later, I'll emphasize more of this because I'm a fan of the process audit that we could do by looking at a checklist to see if someone's following the steps. It could be through an observation, the Gemba walk on the floor, or through interviewing the employees on the floor. And this as well applies to suppliers. If we have some supplier qualification or some supplier certification program that we could hopefully get to the point where we say, hey, it's dock to stock. We don't need the parts to go through receiving inspection. My favorite, here's where I want to pump up the money. Spend money, hire the best. All right, hire the best, and train them to do their job. Spend money on that. It is a solid investment. It's better than spending money on Wall Street. You're going to get a significant rate of return. Document your processes. There should be a standard best way of doing things. I remember I did a work center setup reduction workshop at a company, and I had 10 people who all use similar equipment, and I asked them to document the process in individual exercise. Some of you should not be surprised at all to see I had 10 different procedures there. Each guy or person was doing it their own way. They thought that was the best way. I said, no, there must be one best way. That's the consistent standard. Not only do I want to spend money on the best labor, I want to spend money on the best raw materials or purchase components that come in the door. And this, again, is part of my background where I said the genesis for this topic when I worked in purchasing 20 years ago, and we just beat up suppliers on price. We just picked whoever was the cheapest. And you can guess how well that was working out. We were actually an electronic contract manufacturer. We're placing components on printed circuit boards to the thousandth or 10,000ths of an inch. So we're saying our value to the marketplace is really high quality. Then we turn around and purchase parts from the cheapest suppliers. That is a conflict in our supply chain in terms of what we think adds value. So if you want to set the standard, if you want to be a high quality company, then your supplier should be high quality. It reminds me of Fram Auto Parts back in the 70s and 80s used to have a commercial. They said, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. What they meant by pay me later is if you just buy some cheap generic auto parts, they're going to break down. You're going to end up having to buy the Fram parts anyways. Use integrated technology. Systems that tie into our enterprise resource planning systems, automate to whatever degree is possible, recognizing machines are faster and more accurate than humans. Note, I am not trying to displace employees. I know over the past couple years, I started hearing this stuff that I heard back in the 70s about how automation hurts an economy. That is absolutely nuts. The absolute strongest, highest standard of living, greatest GDPs on the planet Earth are where there's lots of technologies. It means people's job change. Well, instead of building a widget, I'm the guy who's writing the computer numerical control program, right? The most important aspect on this slide, friends, is the idea of a culture of quality. I want everyone to recognize how important this is. And think about this. You know, I mentioned before, we're all quality persons. It's not just the people on the floor, it's people in offices, people in the warehouse. We're all responsible for quality. Think of it like this. Our workers, as opposed to operators, call them artisans, because they're like artists. They're like Vincent van Gogh. They sign their name to the painting. Get that across. Tell that to the workers on the floor. Your name is on every part that comes out of your work center. Take pride in that. You're responsible and accountable. And I'm sure most of us may be familiar with this quote regarding prevention. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Typically, that is attributed to Benjamin Franklin. The original quote, so Mr. Franklin was not the origin here. I'm a big guy on making sure I attribute to sources. That's very important to me. I've been known as kind of the ethics guy. So I looked up is Desiderius Aramis in either the 15th or 16th century who said, prevention is better than cure. So Benjamin Franklin paraphrased that into something which we more commonly use these days. But it makes sense. Preventing errors is better than having to inspect and check. It's better than internal failures and much, much better than external failures. here is a cost versus quality graph that shows us as we spend more money on the cost of good quality, that's the curve that's labeled prevention plus appraisal cost. The more you spend on that, the less you will need to spend on internal and external failures. And ultimately, the total cost of quality comes down. Now, that's only up to a point. We have to acknowledge, I would say if I were suggesting paying your operators, say $50 an hour because you want to attract good labor, well, if someone else came by and said, well, Ford said spend much more money on prevention, so I'm going to pay a machine operator $1 million a year. Okay, that's the point where you're not going to get the return on investment. So the law of diminishing returns applies here. Same thing with inspection. Well, maybe you do end-of-line inspection, but you wouldn't inspect a part that's going through a 100-yard assembly line. You wouldn't stop it every 10 inches and check it again. So there is a point where the total cost of quality actually would bottom out and start to go up again. That's theoretical. I don't know if in practice any company has actually ever gotten to that point. We'll now talk about the different scenarios starting with 100% inspection. This is the pessimistic viewpoint. I am assuming every part here is bad, so I need to check them to find out, is this a good part or is this a bad part? What are the scenarios in which this might be appropriate? Well, where poor quality exists, where a product line or a company has had an issue, you say, well, darn it, I'm going to have to check just to be certain that I don't pass a defect downstream. It could be the case, well, we're not sure. There is no quality history because it's a brand new product line. It could apply when the cost of a defect is prohibitive. In other words, well, maybe actually dollars cost or the impact on the customer is severe. We're talking about a health issue or a threat to somebody's life. There is a safety concern. It could be we do 100% inspection because it is a customer mandate. They have dictated to us that we will check every part. Or it could be something resulting from government regulation, perhaps the food and beverage, or perhaps in the airline industry or pharmaceuticals. There could be something where government has mandated you got to check everything. Now, there are definitely some challenges here with 100% inspection. There can be a fatigue issue. If you got to check every part, if we're talking, where it's human inspection. There's something known as pencil whipping. That's where you're starting to just fudge the numbers. There could be pressure from management for you to pass the part. There could be something known as flinching. You flinch. You're like, that didn't seem to pass, but I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. There could also be justification. And I've experienced this at different companies. In other words, inspectors need to justify their jobs. Because if they passed everything, we just say, well, must be parts are good. We don't need to inspect. So I've had this situation where inspectors, I swear they were rejecting things just to make themselves feel important and justify their existence. Now, I mentioned these issues with humans. So automated inspection can be much better, can be faster, but it can be expensive equipment. And let's also recognize automated systems for inspection are not necessarily going to be 100%. I'm not saying they're not better than humans. They sure can be. But do not believe that it's impossible for a defect to not get by automated inspection. There could also be times where, well, we don't want an automated system. Maybe a human is better. I did some consulting with a fine arts paint company. By fine arts paint, I'm not talking Sears weather beater. I'm talking the stuff that's sold at Michael's and costs more for a 12-ounce tube than a gallon of Sears weather beater. All right. They had some people who worked in the paint production lines who could just tell, they could eyeball it, and they could see that was the right shade of violet blue or sea blue or something like that. They had just had this skill. And I had an opportunity to tour a fragrance processing facility a couple years ago where they said there are people who just have super sensitive noses. And this was a company that made things like perfumes and things like that. They said, these people have this skill set. They can smell something. Our automated equipment couldn't detect that. And of course, because I love food, you know, the idea of a chef tasting something, you know, can a machine detect what's the right flavor, how much more spices you need to add? I mentioned with 100% inspection, we're assuming there are defects out there. And this goes back to that pessimistic view of Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. And I always like to get the sourcing correct. So I said, where does this come from? And I looked it up. And this original quote was by Captain Ed Murphy of the United States Air Force back in 1949. There was an Air Force project, I believe it was in San Diego or somewhere in Southern California. And he was referring to a wiring technician who kept screwing things up. Every time he's working on something, he screwed it up. And Captain Murphy said, if there is any way to do it wrong, he will. It's just that pessimistic viewpoint that says we need to do inspection because we absolutely believe something may have gone wrong. Contrary to 100% inspection, in other words, the opposite extreme, we say there's no inspection. This is the optimistic point of view. I assume all the parts are good. I don't need to check any of them. So it could be I don't need receiving inspection. I mentioned before the certified or qualified suppliers. I've validated their processes. They've got a great history, stock to stock. I don't need to check it. I trust what the label says on the box. It's the right quantity, the right quality, the right item. We have statistical process control in place, which could mean referring to our suppliers, or we're saying internally, I have control of a process. A quality process produces quality output. It could be we do no inspection because defects are highly improbable. I'm not saying impossible. I'm just saying there's such an extremely low probability of them occurring, I don't need to check. Or, contrary to 100% inspection, they are of limited consequence. We're talking very small dollar amount, not a severe impact on the downstream customer, and not a safety threat. The next is statistical sampling. Now that's somewhat in between 100% and 0%. I said 100% is the pessimistic viewpoint. I think they're all bad. You got to prove to me they're good. No inspection says, no, I assume they're all good. Statistical sampling is in the middle. I'm not sure if these parts are good or bad, so I'm going to take observations from a sample. I'm not checking to see if a part is good or bad. I'm checking to determine, based on the sample, whether the lot is good or bad. So you either accept or reject the entire lot of parts. Now, the advantages versus 100% inspection, well, the time savings, the labor savings, the equipment savings, if we're talking this is done by automation or machines, and avoiding the inspection fatigue. However, we could have some disadvantages, or perhaps I should say the limitations. These are what's known in hypothesis testing as type 1 and type 2 errors. Type 1 is a false rejection of a good lot. In other words, you drew the conclusion that this was defective and you reject it, even though in fact it was a good lot. Type 2 is a false acceptance. You drew a statistical conclusion that the lot was good, even though it was actually bad. We recognize It's got a lot of advantages, but we have limitations. We may need to use it when 100% inspection is not practical. A couple of cases where it's not practical. Well, what if your typical lot size is 1,000-piece order or 10,000 piece? It just doesn't make sense. It's cost prohibitive to check every part. There's not enough time. There's no way you could do it, even with automation. Or another case where statistical sampling applies, where the testing is destructive testing. So you're only going to destroy a couple sample parts. In other words, you're testing the limits of a part until it fails. Well, if you did destructive testing on every single part would be destroyed. So that just wouldn't make sense. The fourth scenario we're looking at is process auditing. This is one of my favorites. I mentioned before, I don't really like checking parts. I want to make sure that I'm doing things right. So if my transformation process has quality, quality will result. I might be talking about this from a manufacturing process. If a manufacturing process is a quality process, then quality widgets come out of it. But this applies to office, to the service industry, to any activity. So parts, instead of parts, I could say product. I know sometimes people interchange the terms products with parts. I do not do that. Products can be physical goods or a service. They're usually a combination of both. But let's recognize this applies to the office as well. This is another one that's very near and dear to my heart because I've seen where problems that go downstream to the marketplace are not the fault of anything that happened on the floor. There's something that happened as a result of office personnel mistakes. So we can check a procedure. This documented procedure that I had mentioned before, observing the work activities to see that somebody's in compliance, and interviewing employees, talking to them. Not grilling them like you're a prosecuting attorney, but you're inquiring. You're trying to learn about them, their job, and what they do. It's a matter of being very objective. You're not trying to fail somebody. You're not trying to put pressure on anyone. You're trying to learn and be as objective as possible. Process auditing should result in improvements so that ultimately you can eliminate inspection. That goes back to the first bullet point. If you're doing things right, you shouldn't need to check. We may also say process auditing is done where inspection isn't possible. Okay? So there's no parts to check. I guess the service industry, how do you inspect a service? You can audit a service, but you can't inspect it because it'd be while it is being delivered. It's too late to prevent it from going to the marketplace. I'd like to introduce an example here from my experience within supply chain. I'm going to talk about the idea of inventory balance. This has always been fun to me. When I look up in inventory, it says we have 100 parts. And then on Tuesday, we ship out 10. Wednesday, we ship out 10. Thursday, we ship out 10. Friday, I go down to the warehouse, expect to see 70, and there's 55. How this happens is incredible to me, even though I have a lifelong career in inventory management. It's just bizarre. So we talk about things we can do to check to see whether our inventory balance is accurate. The 100% inspection scenario would be the wall-to-wall count, or what we sometimes call a periodic or an annual physical inventory. We count everything. Check to see if it matches the system. Well, those of us with experience in inventory management knows, usually when you do that wall-to-wall count, you end up creating as many mistakes as you fix because you close down your operations, you get people out of offices on the floor, you put them in the warehouse, they're not familiar with locations, unit of measure, and at best, The wall-to-wall count at best just means you open up Monday morning, 8 a.m., your inventory's right. By noon, it's all screwed up again. It didn't do anything to help improve processes or prevent errors. Now, beyond this, the improvement would be statistical sampling, cycle counting. Do a check every day, count a sampling of parts to check on it. While that is an improvement, it doesn't necessarily help unless we follow that up with asking, why was the count wrong? Why were any results of statistical sampling not compliant? So we do an audit. How do inventory errors exist? Is it because the supplier's shipping the wrong thing? Is it our put-away crew isn't familiar with the location scheme? Is it we don't have a documented process for issues or receipts to inventory? Is it because we don't have a consistent training process or we don't train people at all? The ultimate goal of cycle counting should be to investigate why errors occur, do the audits, make quality improvements. And ultimately, the goal of counting should be to eliminate counting because I don't need to check. So we aspire to the ultimate form of benchmarking, that is adopting best practices. One of the things that COVID has made tough for me is 5K races. They've all been canceled over the past 6 months. But ordinarily, I love doing the 5K races. I like competing in my age group. And I have come to recognize if I wish to be able to run the fastest 5K in my gender and age group, I can't just set a target. Let's say it's 21 minutes. I can't just say, oh, well, I'm running 22 minutes for a 5K. Well, I just look at the clock, it says 21. I just got to run faster. No, I need to adopt best practices. That means adopting the diet, the exercise and training regimen, the sleeping and rest patterns of the persons who are running faster. If I wish to run faster, I need to adopt the best practices of world-class runners. So, number one, allocate resources, spend the cash, hire the people, buy better raw materials, do the training, standardize your processes. Make sure we stress that quality at the source. We are all responsible for the quality of the work we do. We have that ownership. And I would reference barbecue. I'm hoping we all love barbecue. This is actually the concept of behavior-based quality. I would like to reference the ASQ's Quality Progress Journal, the March 2018 edition. There is an article on BBQ, Behavior-Based Quality. That's March 2018 edition of Quality Progress. So this is that zero defect mentality. We can do it. And I know, sometimes people say, well, mistakes are going to happen. It's like I said before, they happen where we tolerate them. Think if historically you thought 95% was a good yield for a process. We're used to thinking on this traditional scale of 0 to 100%. Is a 95% yield acceptable in terms of live births at a maternity room at a hospital? In other words, you're okay if 1 out of every 20 infants does not survive. I trust there's nobody listening to this who would agree with that. What about 95% on takeoffs and landings at airports? In other words, 1 out of every 20 planes crashes? You would never accept that. How about 95% level of quality at a restaurant? In other words, 1 out of every 20 times the wait staff screws up your order. Would you go back to that restaurant? You never would. So there are places or situations in life where we do have damn near 0 defects, 100% yield. It is those cases where we say we refuse to accept defects. Let's institute poka-yoke. I'm always thinking of this mistake proofing whenever I'm on the road. Because when I rent a car, I know If I drive out the wrong way and I don't stop at the gate so they can make sure I have the paperwork, well, then I'm going to hit those spikes and get a flat tire and I won't be able to leave. When I get to my hotel, I do not need to measure out the coffee. It's good for 1 cup. I don't need to measure the water. I just use the cup. They've perfected the process. Don't have to remember to turn off. I usually do, but if I don't worry, it shuts itself off. The 6S concept, a place for everything, everything in its place. Friends, it is remarkable to me over the course of my career, whenever I notice walking through the office area of a company, if people's desks are messy and disorderly, and it looks like somebody dropped a bomb on the offices, there's paperwork everywhere, nothing seems orderly, it is absolutely remarkable, the consistency, when I walk out onto the floor and all the orders are backed up, they're behind schedule, they're expediting, and then I walk out to the warehouse and there's pallets lying around, things aren't put away, poor inventory accuracy. It is remarkable the consistencies that you see between the office, the manufacturing floor, and the warehouse when it comes to keeping things in order. Doesn't matter to me if it's a work order, a pallet of inventory, or documentation in an office. You will see the consistency. We want things orderly and in place, easy to spot and useful. I'm a fan of the Jidoka process, stopping a line. You get a defect, shut down the line. That's from the Toyota production system. Some American manufacturers say, well, I ain't shutting down the line. Oh, but you had a defect. Okay, well, keep the line running. We'll just build extra inventory. Well, that means you're using inventory to mask the problems. The concept of Jidoka says, shut down the line, stop. Find out what went wrong. How did this defect occur? How did it get to this point in the line? Do the root cause analysis and prevent it from happening again. To those who would argue, well, you're losing productivity, you're losing labor, you're using machine time, I say no, not in the long run. When you stop, find the cause of the error, and prevent it from happening again, you will actually gain utilization in the long run. And something I am proud to have learned over the course of my lifetime. So years ago, working on engineering degrees, being a true anal retentive left-brainer, who thought there's a perfect solution to every problem, who thought linear programming could solve every problem on the planet Earth, I had no use for soft skills. I didn't care about the right-brainer, touchy-feely, artsy-fartsy people. And I was wrong. By this point in my career, I have realized how much more important the soft skills are. It's not how high-tech your product is. It's not how automated your line is. It's not how great your SAP system is. It's leadership. It's teamwork. It's communication. It's adopting a quality philosophy almost as if it's a religion that we believe in. In the words of the great economist, Dr. Thomas Sowell, he said, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. So we will make trade-offs here, deciding, is it 100%? Zero inspection? Is it sampling? Well, is it process auditing? It's prevention. We will pump money. It will cost us more money in prevention, but we will save money in the other areas of appraisal and defects. So in summary, we talked about the 4 costs of quality. We talked about 3 different approaches to inspection. Check everything, the pessimistic viewpoint. I'm assuming the parts are bad. No inspection. That's the optimistic viewpoint. I'm assuming all parts are good. Statistical sampling. I'm doing an experiment. I'm drawing a conclusion based on a sample as to whether the lot should pass or not. Then the concept of process auditing. Make sure the process is right so that the output can be assured of having high quality. We'll handle questions for the next 10 minutes in just a second. I wanted to make sure you have my contact info here. It is Michael D. Ford at earthlink.net. My mobile number that is both voice and text enabled is +1 for the USA, area code 607-648-7216. I pride myself on providing training that I like to say is edutaining. You'll get educated, but it'll be entertaining as well, because that's the way to learn. You got to be having fun. So now I will check with Chris for what questions we may have over the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mike. Your timing is impeccable almost. We have about 8 minutes left until the hour's over. So I'll point out a couple of key points, and I'll give people a couple of moments to make sure that they have time to ask questions. And I have a couple of questions I wrote down, and I'll start with one of the first ones because there's actually quite a reference. And I remember reading that article in the Quality Progress magazine, and that was one of the first articles I read that actually took employee morale and attitude into consideration for quality. Would you like to expand upon that BBQ concept a little bit?
Well, it includes a lot of what I said about the idea of making sure we have the process auditing in place, but then also the behaviors, and it goes beyond manufacturing to suggest it's a service environment, or it's people in distribution or retail, or it could even be people for nonprofits or for charities. It could be anybody who works in the military, and it includes everybody from the CEO right down to, say, third shift facilities maintenance persons. Reiterating that idea that everybody has responsibility for that and needs to understand everything they do, they have to do that right.
Excellent. I'm going to start going for first one here. What other books or resources recommend for someone interested in learning more about choosing between the different types and levels of inspection? Are there any resources out there you can refer anyone to, Mike?
I don't have any offhand, except to say in general, Duran's Quality Handbook, it covers everything you need to know to cover those things. I would also say Google, although I have some issues with Google, one of the more powerful things is whatever books come up at the top of your search are probably the best ones. That's why they're getting the most hits. Warning, be careful. The first couple hits we know may be sponsored ads. Totally ignore them. I would also recommend the ASQ website, asq.org. Look under Certified Quality Technician or Certified Quality Inspector. Whatever references the ASQ suggests, I would endorse those.
Excellent. I got a lot of questions coming in on the presentation materials. What we'll do is I'll get a copy of Mike's slides, and I'll put those on the Inspection Division YouTube page with the video once I upload the video in a couple days. So that will be available on the YouTube Inspection Division YouTube page. Another point I want to bring out, I noticed you mentioned, I love how you rolled kind of the score model right into the perfect quality for delivery. Do you want to talk a little bit about the score model?
Gee, I didn't even know I did that. You mean the 9 R's of the perfect order? Because
yes,
it's interesting. Over my career, I've heard the 3 R's of getting it right, the 4 R's, the 5 R's, and I eventually got it up to the 9 R's of the perfect order. And I guess it's even more than 9 R's. I mean, everything has to be done right. It's just got to be perfect from the customer's perspective. I will also note this, depending on your environment, maybe there's some things the customer doesn't care too much about. So maybe this isn't directly tying into score, but I would dare suggest this. Sometimes we fail to recognize what's important to our customers. Maybe you think short lead time is really important to your customer, but maybe it's not. If they're a make-to-order or engineer-to-order environment, they really care a lot about quality and everything being perfect. And sometimes customers might be willing to wait. So I would suggest making sure we understand for our environment what needs to be done right. And it doesn't need to be everything. I mean, everything needs to be done right, but I should clarify here. It doesn't have to be the lowest price, the shortest lead time, the greatest product variety, because you can't be all things to all people.
Excellent. I don't see too much, just a lot of requests for the presentation materials.
Let
With that
me
being said, are
then
there any
suggest,
comments that you want to?
I would suggest this, since everyone will be able to get a look at the presentation, let me see, make sure if, when they look at the presentation, they'll make sure to be able to copy my contact information, or we can see it again here. I just want to make sure. I am very, very interested if anybody comes up with questions later or any comments and feedback. I'm also very interested in how I can improve this. So Michael D. Ford at earthlink.net, 607-648-7216, comments or further questions. And maybe the last comment I would say is to, again, think beyond manufacturing, all right? It's more than just building widgets. It's providing the service. It's things we do in offices, or I guess things we're doing at home right now while sitting around in our boxer shorts. Everything we do, think about that having quality. Your communications with suppliers, your communications with coworkers, every task and activity, let's aspire to zero defects.
There is a great question. It says, for process audits and in-house audits are easy to implement, but can you elaborate on process auditing suppliers?
That's interesting to hear that internal audits are easier. I guess that's a little bit different from my experience. And maybe I'm not understanding, because I think it's always tougher to judge ourselves. I think it's easier to be critical, and I don't mean critical just in a bad way. I mean honest assessment and more objective when we're auditing somebody else. And I think it's a fair expectation to be able to ask any potential suppliers, if you want our business, we wish to come inside. We wish to see how things are done. We wish to see that you have documented procedures and quality control processes in place. I know this is a challenge now with COVID, because I've heard from some people, well, there ain't no moving around, there ain't no flying planes or whatever, and this was a couple months ago. They're like, how do you do the on-site? So I'll just say, okay, COVID might be an exception case, but it's worth the value of the on-site visits and the face-to-face communication. If we say, well, I'm buying my parts from Southeast Asia, well, why are you doing that? You're going to tell me that's how I get my cheap widgets, which contradicts what I said earlier. Do business with local suppliers. That gives you the opportunity for the more personal relationships and the personal communications and the on-site audits. If we are saying that an external audit is more challenging than an internal, I don't know why that would be, because the key thing is objectivity. I don't care if I'm checking, inspecting my kids' bedrooms to see if they're clean, or I'm going across to the neighborhood to inspect their bedrooms are clean. It makes no difference to me because I'm cold-hearted and cold-blooded. Doesn't mean I'm mean and nasty. It just means that feelings are not a part of it. Now, if the neighbor across the way says, no, you can't inspect my children's bedrooms, well, then my kids ain't going to play with you. In other words, with the supplier, okay, I don't have to purchase from you. And it becomes their choice. It's not mine. They chose not to do business.
That's a great analogy. I appreciate everyone's time today. I know it's 3:01. It's 1 minute after the hour, so I know it's in the middle of the workday. So I want to get everybody off the call back to work. If there's any other questions, you can always email myself. You'll get your ASQ RUs. You will get an automated email at the end of the presentation. Once you disconnect, that is your certificate for your RUs. You can always send me a question, or you can contact Mike directly. You see his contact information on screen. Once again, on behalf of the ASQ Inspection Division and APIX for introducing me to Mike Ford, we wish everybody joining this event today and look forward to our next event next month. That email should be going out shortly. Thanks again, Mike, and everybody have a good day. Yeah, I'm still on, and what I'm going to say is what we'll do is at the end, I'll get your mailing address at some point, and we'll send out a small token of appreciation to you from the Inspection Division for putting on this presentation for us.
Right. Just wanted to say, when I tried to close the PowerPoint show, I thought it was going to come back to a visual of me, but it did not. So it kind of doesn't matter too much now, but I'm trying to think, how should I have done that? In other words, I'm trying right now to...
That's not it.
Huh?
It may be something that's not enabled in the WebEx control panel.
Okay.
Let me see here. Yeah, WebEx just has some weird functions here, and we tried that in another call, and we had to enable that in the WebEx settings before the meeting starts. Okay. So like right now, when I go into the settings, video is not checked off as being allowed. I think that's just to reduce the bandwidth. But it was a great turnout. Okay. We had over 100 people log in. So. Oh,
fantastic. Are we the only two left before I make, I'm not going to, not like I'm going to curse or anything.
There's still about 40 people logged in, but I can call you personally. I can give you a call on the phone if you want to chat afterwards briefly.
There's just a couple of things to debrief on, so call me at your convenience.
All right, I'll give you a call in a minute, Mike.
Thank you very much.